Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The South Carolina State Hospital. Stories from Bull Street by William Buchheit. Narrated by Lofbomm. Introduction. In early 2010, I was ambling through a Barnes & Noble when a large photo book caught my eye. Under the cover's image of a dangling straitjacket screamed the title in red capital letters, Asylum. Inside the closed world of state mental hospitals. The second I opened the book, I was captivated. Its creator, New York photographer Christopher Payne, had visited dozens of abandoned state hospitals across America, shooting both the interiors and exteriors of the castle-like structures. Perhaps the most illuminating facet of Payne's work is its assertion that these institutions did a lot more than treat and house the mentally ill. In essence, they functioned as self-sustaining communities, with their own greenhouses, slaughterhouses, bowling alleys, dairies, stables, laundries, cemeteries, and full-service medical facilities. However, the thing I found most interesting about Asylum was the way it provided a visual history of psychiatric treatment in our country. Most of the hospitals Payne photographed have been reasonably well preserved and remain intact. Anyone who tours the hospitals is transported to a bygone era when the colossal structures pulsed and howled with the afflicted. Asylum did more than spark my curiosity and imagination. It created a yearning in me to see and photograph one of these old mental hospitals firsthand. The asylum closest to my house, in upstate South Carolina, is the South Carolina State Hospital in downtown Columbia. It was a sprawling 180-acre property that was tucked away from the general public for nearly 2 centuries. Known statewide as Bull Street because its entrance lies at the corner of Bull and Elmwood. The South Carolina State Hospital is the nation's second oldest public mental facility, admitting its first patient in 1828. Even though I'd lived within a mile of the institution as a graduate student from 1998 to 2001, I'd never once been inside its gates. All that changed on Super Bowl Sunday 2010, when I drove through the campus on my way back home from a bachelor party in Charleston. It was a cold, wet afternoon, and since I had no game plan at the time, I drove toward the single-level structures at the rear of the property. Eventually, I parked my car behind the Saunders building, where it would be less visible, and grabbed my camera. A few minutes later, I was scouring the back porch of Saunders when I discovered a door that had been propped open. With my heart hammering against my sternum, I pushed the door forward and squeezed through the opening to get inside. The Saints and Colts were just hours away from kicking off the Super Bowl, but it's hard to imagine that any of the players were as excited and nervous as I was inside those unfamiliar surroundings. Perspiration stung my scalp as I inhaled the musty air and gazed at the thick strips of paint peeling off the walls. It was clear the building hadn't functioned as a hospital for at least a decade, because there was little in the way of artifacts to be found. Yet the darkness, silence, and decay trapped inside the building had an inescapable allure. I thought about the prospects of ghosts, security guards, and homeless people finding me inside. But most of all, I wondered about what had taken place in the hospital when it flowed with life. Over the next 18 months, I returned nearly 24 times to explore and photograph the decaying hospital's campus. Along the way, my interest in Bull Street went from abstract curiosity to undeniable obsession. As many hours as I spent creeping through the menacing darkness of the hospital, I spent just as many off-campus researching the institution's history. I found it stunning how little had been written about the hospital, and continued to think about all the lives that had been saved, changed, and lost there. During those years of research, I was still working full-time for a chain of newspapers in Spartanburg, and I thought it might be interesting to write a series on Bull Street. Who better to tell the story of the hospital, I figured, than the men and women who'd worked there? So I spoke with employees of the South Carolina Department of Mental Health, SCDMH, and asked if they could point me toward any interesting interviewees. Most people gave me the same name, Woody Harris. Around Columbia, Harris had earned a reputation as the state hospital's unofficial historian. As you will hear in the first chapter of this book, the interview did not disappoint. Over a couple hours at his house, Harris relayed stories about the good, bad, and ugly things that he'd witnessed during his long career at Bull Street. To me, it was the world's most interesting place," he explained. Before I left that afternoon, I asked Harris to recommend other former employees to interview. He took a deep breath and said, "Albert and Gertrude Metzi. The Metzis are the only people in this book who worked at the state hospital during the first half of the 20th century. Although they were in their late 80s when I met them in 2010, I found them remarkably lucid when it came to describing their respective careers at Bull Street. I interviewed 2 more subjects that year, former hospital director of budgeting Jack Balling, and its former chief psychologist, Dr. Jack Luadzers. Both revealed critical details about the deinstitutionalization movement that swept through the hospital in the 1980s and 1990s and ultimately led to its demise. That 4-part news series led me to a closer examination of the current state of mental health care in South Carolina, which I quickly learned was deplorable. After publishing several stories on the failures of the system the following year, I slowly gained the attention of advocacy groups around the state. In 2011, I was awarded the Reporter of the Year award by the South Carolina chapter of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI. I received the honor at a NAMI banquet at the Embassy Suites in Columbia, and to this day, it remains the most treasured award of my career. Despite this positive recognition, as 2012 arrived, the Bull Street project went cold. The only story I would write that year would be that of Rachel Bricko, a retired nurse from Greenville who had worked in the state hospital's Burns building in the mid-1980s. The following year, 2013, I again wrote one state hospital story, which was that of Tom Summers, who had served as the institution's chaplain for 4 decades. Apart from those articles, it appeared as if my sources from the hospital had dried up. No matter how many times I spoke to locals and SCDMH employees, I just could not find another former state hospital employee to interview. For more than a half-decade, I ceased writing about and photographing the institution, and I felt content moving on to the next chapter of my life. But after a temporary move to Charleston for another job, I returned to Greenville and contemplated resuming the state hospital project. My recent business endeavor had taught me the power of social media advertising, and I promptly took out a Facebook advertisement to locate potential subjects. It read, "I am compiling a book of people's memories of the old Bull Street Hospital in Columbia. If you ever worked or visited there, I'd love to talk to you." I also created a Facebook page named SC State Hospital Book, where I posted some of the stories I'd written and photos I'd taken from 2010 to 2012. To my delight, my advertisement garnered responses almost immediately. One of the first people to contact me was Linda McLam, who worked at Bull Street during the summer of 1961 as a student nurse. Hers was a harrowing and horrifying tale about one of the more difficult periods in the hospital's history. McLam spared few details as she recounted the overcrowding, understaffing, neglect, and hopelessness she observed while working in the Saunders building. The retired nurse even gave a vivid account of seeing a patient days after she'd received a lobotomy, the much demonized brain surgery that historians have claimed was never performed on the Bull Street campus. My story on McLam, which ran on May 23, 2018, in the Greer Citizen, signified my full-fledged return to the project after 5 years. It also rekindled my journalistic fire and restored my hope that I'd one day have enough stories for a book. When I posted the story on Facebook, it garnered a substantial response, especially from those in the Midlands. After that article was published on social media, my search for subjects became easier, and I was able to interview at least one former state hospital employee every week of the summer in 2018. At first, it was mostly nurses who contacted me, and boy did they have some stories to tell. In their stories, they described their experiences with suicides, patient attacks, electroshock therapy, and virtually every conceivable mental disorder known to man. In addition, they told me how it was usually their job to administer medication, update records, and share vital information with patients. After all, as any former Bull Street employee can attest, most of the psychiatrists who worked there in the second half of the 20th century were immigrants who didn't speak English very well. Because of this, nurses were also usually the highest-ranking mental health workers with whom patients could talk. Gradually, I did manage to achieve some diversity in my subjects, something I considered essential to any comprehensive study of the hospital. Public safety officers Phil Parker and Sam Alexander worked to keep the peace when patients or staff members got out of hand. Volunteer Robin Stancic spent half a decade entertaining schizophrenic women whose families had dropped them off on Bull Street, never to return. Activity therapists Loretta Smith and Kim Grant, meanwhile, designed recreational projects and off-campus field trips so patients could actually have some fun. Social workers at the state hospital also played a critical role in patient treatment. John McMaster, the current governor's older brother, worked with patients who'd been ruled not guilty of crimes by reason of insanity. After he helped mold that unit into one of the best of its kind in any U.S. state hospital, McMaster spearheaded Bull Street's Employee Assistance Program and became the primary counselor to hundreds of the hospital's employees. Melton Francis, meanwhile, began working in the admission wards of the hospital after he earned a master's degree in social work from the University of South Carolina in 1977. During his 18 months at Bull Street, he witnessed the inherent problems of deinstitutionalization and watched a revolving door of patients go through the hospital. Though this book primarily focuses on the stories of those who worked at the state hospital, there are a few exceptions. The first of these is the chapter on Carol Hall Martin and her brother Richard Hall. Those two fine people are the only living children of the iconic William S. Hall, who served as state hospital superintendent for 2 decades before becoming South Carolina's first mental health commissioner in the 1960s. During his career, which lasted for nearly 5 decades, Hall relentlessly campaigned for more state dollars to be allotted toward mental health, as his hospital was consistently one of the 3 most underfunded public psychiatric institutions in the nation. Hall's love for Bull Street, its patients, and its staff is documented in this book through the vivid memories of his children. Then I've included the story of one brave patient, Jan Wise. Though over the years I've spoken to more than a few people who were committed to the institution, most of them preferred to remain anonymous, and it isn't hard to see why. Even as the 3rd decade of this new century dawns, mental illness continues to carry a heavy stigma in American culture. Yet, from the moment I first spoke with her, Jan Wise wanted to tell her story without the protection of anonymity in order to help others like her who are facing major psychiatric disorders. Wise was committed to Bull Street soon after her second suicide attempt in 1982, and she credits a doctor there with helping her get back on her feet. Not only did her stay at Bull Street return her to functionality, it allowed her to flourish, earn a degree in psychology, and dedicate her life to helping children. First at the South Carolina Department of Juvenile Justice, DJJ, and then at the Boys and Girls Club of the Midlands. In 20th century American culture, the state hospital became a symbol of captivity, horror, and chaos. Indeed, the prospect of losing one's freedom is terrifying enough, but the thought of losing one's mind along with it is too grim for most souls to entertain. Hollywood's portrayal of the state hospital as some kind of hell on earth, full of sadistic doctors, mean nurses, shackles, straitjackets, and ice-pick lobotomies did not ease these fears. Such stories and films left a mark on our collective perceptions that is as glaring and irreversible as a surgical scar. Human beings fear the unknown, and most Americans have never seen the inside of a state hospital. In writing this book and telling the stories of these special men and women, I hope to illustrate the iconic Bull Street institution as a place that not only did a lot of good, but also served a critical purpose. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, the South Carolina State Hospital housed, fed, and treated thousands of patients who were incapable of surviving on their own. When it was first introduced, the community care model of psychiatric treatment that was designed to replace the state hospital model sounded good enough. But the decades that followed have only revealed inadequate funding, overstretched social workers, and a growing population of homeless folks who can neither afford medicine nor care for themselves. As you'll see in the following stories, daily life at the South Carolina State Hospital wasn't always pleasant, but it did employ caring and empathetic professionals who were fully committed to making the hospital better. 1. The Hospital Historian. You will find people who say they hated it, and others who say they wished to hell they still had it, and they are both correct. Woody Harris. A Little Mini-City. When I told Woody Harris of my plans to write a series of articles on the people who lived and worked at the South Carolina State Hospital, he warned me that their stories would be very different. What you're going to find are people who will swear that the hospital was utter horror and that it was immoral, he said. Then you will have others that will tell you it was wonderful and that it was absolutely what they needed to stabilize them. You will find people who say they hated it and others who say they wish to hell they still had it. And they are both correct. Perhaps no institution in recent history has polarized South Carolinians like the old hospital at 2100 Bull Street in Columbia. Opened in the 1820s as the South Carolina Lunatic Asylum, the Department of Mental Health, DMH, changed the facility's name to the South Carolina State Hospital for the Insane in 1896, and then to the South Carolina State Hospital the following century. Harris arrived at Bull Street nearly 40 years ago while completing a Ph.D. in counseling and adult education at the University of Georgia. In the early 1970s, the feds were jumping all over institutions, saying we needed to have a basic level of services for clients, said Harris, now 64 years old. They brought me in to establish an adult patient education program, both in academics and teaching living with illness type skills. But the job was hardly the educator's first experience working with the mentally ill. As a graduate student in Virginia, he took an internship at Eastern State Hospital in Williamsburg, the nation's oldest state psychiatric facility. I thought it was the most interesting damn place I'd ever been to in my life, he said of Eastern State Hospital. It was horrible in a lot of ways, and it was wonderful in a lot of ways. But you did stuff that was incredibly interesting. And you had a lot of diversity. Harris is one of the few people who can say he worked in both the oldest, Virginia, and second oldest, South Carolina, state hospitals in the United States. The glaring difference between the two hospitals was that the Bull Street facility was massive. In the early 1960s, Bull Street held 6,600 patients. In 1971, that total was down to around 3,000, when Harris, a Norfolk, Virginia native, took his post as the hospital's director of education. His office was on the second floor of the Babcock Building, a gargantuan 215,000 square foot structure assembled according to the 1854 asylum model of psychiatrist Thomas Kirkbride. Its design featured 3 wings branching out from either side of the administration building. Males were housed on the north side of the building, and females were on the south side, while the least functional patients were kept in the wards farthest from the center. During his first 20 years at the hospital, Harris spent most of his days teaching patients skills such as reading, cooking, and how to function with debilitating illnesses, including schizophrenia. In turn, Harris's patients taught him things, like how to play chess and speak French. You had to be kind of careful, because you could get very attached to patients you worked with for a long time, he explained. There were patients that I considered my friends. We used to have a real mix of people. We'd get professional golfers, high school teachers, hobos, and bums. All kinds of people all mixed in. The former director said that while the hospital had its share of incurable, regressive, and violent patients, among them the serial killer Pee Wee Gaskins, most of those who were committed were eventually released. People have the idea in this state, like most other states, that people went into the state hospital and never came out. That's not true, Harris said. Yeah, they would go in there and they would spend a long time, 6 months, a year, something like that, but most of them got out. In fact, Harris claimed that many patients were stable enough to take off-campus field trips. It's amazing to me how we used to take thousands of patients to the state fair and things like that, and we had very little trouble, he said. The hospital also had its fair share of on-site attractions and entertainment. Harris said that it functioned almost like a little mini-city, boasting its own theater, greenhouse, pool room, and gymnasium, as well as a canteen, church, and ice cream parlor. On a large pastoral field in the middle of the campus, called Fellowship Park, a traveling circus would even set up camp each year, fully equipped with tents, clowns, and elephants. A fundamental flaw. While Harris admitted there were episodic incidents of patients attacking and injuring staff, he said that he found the community's collective fear of mental patients was mostly unjustified. Though there were several suicides during his tenure at Bull Street, Harris said he couldn't recall one homicide that occurred on facility grounds. Still, when he invited people to visit the campus, he said they would either decline outright or appear very ill at ease while there. "A lot of people think of mental patients as dangerous and all that," he explained. "Well, they're dangerous all right. They're dangerous to themselves. They'll walk around in dangerous neighborhoods or on busy streets, and usually they're the ones who get robbed and raped and attacked. Gravely ill patients were placed in high-security wards and rooms for this reason, while those prone to self-injury, Harris claimed several patients pulled their own eyes out, often had to be restrained and placed on 24-hour watch. Obviously, the job wasn't for everyone, and there were times that the state hospital struggled to find nurses and orderlies to fill positions. Incidents of staff members assaulting and stealing from patients were not unheard of, and Harris said the administration fired several workers who simply didn't have the empathy to provide decent care. While the hospital's forensics building for mentally ill prisoners was manned wall-to-wall with trained police officers, the other wards relied on civilian staff to keep things in order. One of the skills Harris's department taught DMH workers was how to decompress agitated, overstressed patients. He said attempts to calm patients frequently failed, however, because the asylum structure itself was so inherently stressful. He explained, "See, you've got a fundamental flaw anyway when you put people into a psychiatric hospital. What society is saying to you is, you're so screwed up and unable to deal with society that we're going to put you in a ward with 35 of the strangest and most difficult people from all over the state." It was kind of fundamentally flawed, taking people who were having a great deal of difficulty coping and then expecting them to cope. Despite the hospital's peculiar treatment design and diverse assortment of mental infirmity, Harris said many patients did in fact improve during their institutionalization. The most significant challenge, he asserted, usually came when it was time to release the patients back into society. "Basically, it's hard as hell to put them anywhere," he said. "Some counties don't have one psychiatric facility. As a result, large numbers of long-term psych patients who used to live all over the state ended up back here in Columbia, because that's where the best services were likely to be." The DMH never had the funds or resources to establish an adequate network of services throughout the state. Hoping it would facilitate the reintegration of patients back into their communities, the hospital began placing patients from the same regions and counties in the same wards. But, like so many strategies the administration conceived, this so-called catchment system was good for some, but not all. While most patients improved during their time at Bull Street, Harris also witnessed many deteriorate. "A lot of them would remarkably improve, but there are also people that we did a great disservice by putting them in the state hospital. The worst thing about working there, I think, probably was the fact that there were patients that it did damage to, because it didn't meet their needs and was kind of contrary to what they needed. There were people there that needed to be in the community with structure, and we didn't have it. It was cruel to them." Overall, however, the quality of care at the state hospital improved dramatically during its last half-century as a functional asylum. As Peter McCandless detailed in his comprehensive 1996 book, Moonlight, Magnolias, and Madness, the hospital was in deplorable shape after the Civil War, when South Carolina went from being one of America's richest states to one of its poorest. Harris said that by the time he started working there, however, the quality of treatment probably ranked somewhere in the middle of the over 200 state institutions in the United States. Ironically, the state's conservative tendencies ended up saving Bull Street a lot of bad publicity during the 20th century. For instance, because the hospital was slow to embrace modern psychiatric trends, it is said that its doctors never once sterilized a patient or performed a lobotomy, the popular brain operation of the 1940s and 1950s that is now considered one of the cruelest procedures in the annals of medicine. Another 20th century trend the facility was slow to employ was the deinstitutionalization movement, which called for the emptying of long-term mental hospitals on the grounds that they did patients more harm than good. When state hospitals in the Northeast and Midwest abruptly dumped thousands of their patients back into society to fend for themselves. Many either died or wound up imprisoned or homeless. Harris claimed Bull Street released its patients far more gradually. In fact, by the time the state hospitals started emptying their buildings in the 1980s and 1990s, most other state institutions were already vacant and boarded up. Harris retired from the DMH years ago, and now directs a lot of his energy toward restoring antiques. On occasion, though, he still gets in his car and drives back through the old hospital gates, fondly reflecting on his 3 decades inside them. To me, it was the world's most interesting place. I think the parameters of behavior you'd see every day are what most people might only see once in a lifetime. It was incredibly interesting, he said. 2. A marriage made on Bull Street. Those who were real disturbed, the ones who would fight and you couldn't control, we would pack them in cold, wet sheets that would effectively strap them to a bed. It might take 3 or 4 of us, but we'd get them in. Gertrude Metzi. No one left on Earth spent as much time at the South Carolina State Hospital as Elbert or Gertrude Metzi did. They've been married now for 64 years, but had yet to meet when they first arrived at the mental asylum in downtown Columbia. Elbert went to work at the hospital straight out of high school, but he was drafted into the military 10 months later, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. From 1942 to 1944, Elbert served in the Army in Northern Africa and Naples, while his future wife studied at the state hospital's nursing school, which trained nurses from 1892 to 1950. It was tough, exhausting work, but she willed herself through it, one 12-hour workday at a time. I never would have made it if my mother wouldn't have said, "I give you 2 weeks," the 88-year-old Gertrude remembered with a grin. I couldn't let her have the last word. The final step of the nursing program required Gertrude to spend a year working at Riverside General Hospital in Charleston. By the time she graduated in 1945 and returned to Bull Street to work full-time, Elbert was also back from the war and working in the hospital's male wards. Fate had set them on a collision course. They finally met at a staff Valentine's Day party in 1945 and married the following year. The 1940s were a notoriously dark decade for American psychiatric institutions, and the South Carolina State Hospital was no exception. The Bull Street facility was dangerously understaffed, and Gertrude recalled that nurses had to physically restrain and subdue hysterical patients without the aid of orderlies or tranquilizers. In hindsight, Gertrude considered some of that era's short-term treatments as almost medieval, but they were standard practices in mid-century U.S. asylums. Gertrude explained, "Those who were real disturbed, the ones who would fight and you couldn't control, nurses would pack them in cold, wet sheets that would effectively strap them to a bed. It might take 3 or 4 of us, but we'd get them in, and you had to keep the sheets wet and check the patient's vital signs frequently. In most of them, it would calm them down for a while, and then they'd have another episode." In the interest of both staff and patients, hospital employees were segregated in those days, with men working exclusively in male wards and women on female halls. Elbert said he and his fellow male coworkers had a less elaborate way of subduing uncontrollable patients. "On the male side, upset patients had to go into restraint suits," he said. "If they were upset, they would put them in a straitjacket for a while, and that sure would calm them down." In the 1940s, Gertrude estimated that the Bull Street Hospital housed around 3,000 patients. While all of them were there for essentially the same reason, the nature and severity of their illnesses varied widely. A portion of them, for example, were allowed to shop, play cards, paint, and walk the grounds whenever they chose. In fact, Gertrude believed some patients were mentally and physically capable of living outside the Bull Street gates, but simply didn't want to leave or had nowhere to go. Other patients, of course, were far less stable and had to be kept under lock and key in maximum security wards. But no matter the condition of the patients when they were committed, each spent the first few days inside the Williams building undergoing a preliminary psychiatric evaluation. As Gertrude discovered early on, the unpredictability of the new patients made Williams a dangerous place to work. Not too long after Elbert and I were married, a patient got me by the hair and wouldn't let go. I mean, she had...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?